awards and accolades, I think we could take up the entire hour. So I've edited this down a little bit, Beatrice. So, by way of introduction, I'll let you know, Beatrice holds the Chair of History and International Relations and Global Governance at Utrecht University. She's, amongst others, a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy for the Arts and Sciences, of the Academia Europaea, chair of the Strategic Advisory Council of TNO, Defense, Strategy and Security, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Commander of the Dutch Land Forces. Beatrice has contributed to the emerging research field of security history. She has also published numerous books, including the background of much of today's talk, Fighting Terror After Napoleon. She is, amongst others, a member of the European Council on Foreign Relations, science columnist for NRC Handelsblad, and is a member of the core editors team of Terrorism and Political Violence and Journal of Modern European History. In 2018, Beatrice was awarded the Steven Prize, the highest distinction in Dutch academia. And beyond all of that, we've really enjoyed our interactions with Beatrice because she's an incredibly nice person. So we feel extremely fortunate, and we're very pleased to have Beatrice join us today and present her topic. So I'll turn it over to you, Beatrice.
Well, thank you, Tom and Chris, for this invitation. This extremely gracious introduction. You could skip all the first parts and only keep the last sentence. I like that the best. So thank you for that. And now up to my lecture. What I will do tonight is introduce you to the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. There's so much focus on the Napoleonic period, the revolutionary Napoleonic Wars, and rightly so, because in the words of David Bell, they were the first total war after all. Yet what often remains under-researched, to say the least, is the period and the years and the things that happened right after that. There was a great article in the Journal of Military History in 2016 by Denise Davidson, Christine Haynes, and Jennifer Hoyer, and they underlined that point. They say there's also, from a perspective of military history, what happens to all these soldiers if the battles end, and what happened in the aftermath of Waterloo with all the prisoners of war. How did they get home, and how were they demobilized, and how were they integrated in the country? So in line with their article and their paper, and Christine Haynes also wrote herself on what came afterwards in a very nice book on the cultural exchanges between the Allied soldier and the French peoples. I wanted to bring up that book as well, but today I will share with you some of the insights that I found in my study of the Napoleonic period after 1815, the transformation from that period to the period which is called the Restoration. But I think we should revisit and revise the term, because it was not so much a restoration, it was a transformation, it was an overhaul, not just of the domestic situations, but also of the international situation. And that's exactly one of the starting points with my talk, why study this period, because so many great things, or at least massive things, happened in this period. It was a megalomaniac project, in particular, the Allied occupation of France. That's my starting point. And I'm going to quote Napoleon on this himself. Well, it's allegedly a little bit debated whether he formulated himself in these words, but from the memoirs of the Comte de las Casas from 1823, it's alleged that Napoleon said in 1815, after a 20 years war, after the blood and treasures that were lavished in the common cause, after a triumph beyond all hope, what sort of peace has Britain concluded? Lord Castlereagh had a whole continent at his disposal, and yet what advantage, what indemnity has he secured to his own country? He has signed just such a peace as he would have signed had he been conquered. Napoleon could not understand what the Allies did after 1815. And this question, what sort of peace was it, that prompted me to look into the details? Indeed, what kind of peace? What happened after 1815? Well, Metternich sort of gave an answer to Napoleon. And he wrote to Hardenberg, the Chancellor of Prussia, the War of 1815 is not a war of conquest. So not as Napoleon would have it, it differently. For the Allies, quoting Metternich again, the double aim of the war was bring down the usurpation of Napoleon Bonaparte, fair enough, but the second was install a government that would guarantee order and security for France and Europe as a whole. And this was indeed something new. And Castlereagh also underlined, the British Foreign Minister also underlined this point. He said, when we will remove the Allied armies from the country, from Europe, the system itself will fall into pieces. We need to consolidate this system. And this system should be executed by regularity and method. And what did that mean? Not a conquest, peace, stability, regularity and method. It meant, first of all, that 1.2 million soldiers, the Allied army, the last Allied army of 1814-1815, was in France and was to stay there at least for almost a year, and then would be returned to 150,000 soldiers, but still, and they would occupy first almost a third, and then later it was condensed a bit to the borders, to the north and to the east, but this is the occupational map of France after 1815. Initially, it was thought that the Allies would remain in France for 5 to 7 years, that they would occupy it with 8 countries, resting on the 4 main powers, obviously, Prussia, Britain, Russia, and Austria, but other countries participated as well, as you can see. And they would also make France pay for the war, which was something new in this measure. And you could call this the first European security project in peacetime. We could do this talk in completely military terms, but I wanted to bring the women up, and I also want to bring the emotions up, because oftentimes it's said that after 1815 it was all about the balance of power, restoration of the great powers that be. It was about building fortresses, carrying out all kinds of military tasks, but it's important to bring in the emotions in history, and it's not just my invention. It's even called the emotional turn in history. And I think coming from this first total war, in the words of David Bell, with the disaster, the destruction, the bad harvests, the death and the pain in mind. In the Netherlands, in my home country here, and also my hometown of Utrecht, the demographics went down, and it only happened, the last time that it happened was in the 14th century, during the times of the plague. So these last 3 years of the incorporation of the Netherlands in France, but also the wars in Germany, it was an obliteration of so many peoples and territories. So we need to take into account that people were highly stressed, anxious, traumatized, and they really wanted to have a new type of security. Not just a security as a conquest, but a security that would spread out. As the war was total, the new concept of security also should be total. It should bring stability, order, calm, peace, and quiet. And you can find it also in the novels of Jane Austen, for example, of Walter Scott, who also wrote, for example, Waverley, a famous novel written by Walter Scott. He also writes about the calm against the heavy passions that inflicted so many pains and plagues on a country. He wrote about historical situations, but it was a kind of a collective feeling in the whole of Europe, amongst princesses, but also amongst ordinary people, to bring in a new stage, a new climate of security, peace, calm, and order. Here you see Hortense de Beauharnais, who was on the run with her children, and who wrote in her memoirs about her longing for peace and security. To the right, you see Louisa Adams. It's a beautiful book written also about, on the basis of her memoirs. It's called Miss Adams in Winter, and she was the wife to the then Ambassador Adams to the United States in Russia and later in Paris, who was to become the president of the United States, John Quincy Adams. And the famous thing about Miss Adams is that she traveled in a carriage in 1814-1815 from St. Petersburg to Paris, right through the mobilizing troops of the Napoleonic Wars. She didn't know, of course, that a new war would break out. So that's what she experienced, and she writes about it in very heavy, emotionally charged terminologies. You can see what people came across, what Louisa Adams came across when she traveled in her carriage with a little boy, 7 years old only protected by a veteran. She came to Paris and she wrote about the bodies that she still saw strewn along the countryside, the bones that peeked out of the soil. And as you can see on this picture, people were still busy burying the bodies. There were so many people. The estimations are now about 4 to 5 million people died during Napoleonic Wars. Of course, not all in those last 2 years, but the Battle of Leipzig especially, but also the Waterloo, the other battles, the hunger, the starvation in Germany, especially, of course, in the center of the continent, they spoke to the imagination of horror and destruction. And then, of course, all the demobilizing soldiers. After the 18th of June, after Waterloo was over, you have to imagine that there were thousands of prisoners of war in Britain, but also in Germany. In France, prisoners of war came back to France. Spanish and Portuguese prisoners of war had to return to their country. So you can imagine that the forests and the roads of Europe, they were full of roaming vagabonds, soldiers, deserters perhaps to some extent as well, traveling people, displaced persons, we would call them today. And in the immediate wake of 1815, people didn't know what was going to happen with the Grande Armée, didn't they? So what would happen after the Second Treaty of Paris with this big Napoleonic army? Would they all be disbanded, discarded? Would there be a new army? I love this image. It so beautifully encapsulates the loneliness, the depression perhaps, also of course the emergence of the romanticist idea of nature that stands out even if man obliterates himself. It's Caspar David Friedrich. So, but now back to the politics again. You have to imagine that the people that fought these wars, and now I'm talking about the princes and the generals and the commanders again, they had known each other now for perhaps 20 years already. It's called horseback diplomacy. So from 1812, 1813 onwards, from Breslau via Frankfurt to Paris, they marched on, they knew each other, they communicated with each other almost on a daily basis on what was about to happen with France, what sort of peace. And the treaties that were concluded between 1830 and 1815, they reflected this collective longing for a new type of security. In fact, on the 7th of March, 1815, when the Allied powers just heard in Vienna, they were still deliberating at the Congress of Vienna that was convened in September 1814 to indeed design a new system of peace. When they were still there, some of them already back home, but many of them were still there, they were notified that Napoleon had landed in the south of France, and on the 7th of March 1815, a first collective security treaty was concluded in the annals of European history. It was called the Treaty for Mutual Security. And for the first time in history, the treaty postulated that the alliance that would have to be forged was not just an alliance for wartime, but that the alliance would continue into peacetime, and it would be a plan for the security of Europe after Napoleon was conquered, and a new design for a post-Napoleonic Europe is included in this plan already. You can see the famous political caricatures by Cruikshank. You see the original image to the left, and then to the right, if you zoom in, you see that plan for the security of Europe. So it was really the terminology that was used at those days and months itself that was in use. So, but where can we find that plan if we take this seriously? And that's what I did when I set out to study this period in, 2014. I thought, well, if there is a plan for the security of Europe, it should have been drafted on the basis of Allied cooperation. And this Allied cooperation was there, as I just said. There were military headquarters, there were sources. Sources were, of course, not kept in a central place. There was no NATO yet, no European Communion or Commission, what have you. But there was already a notion of an allied council, an allied cooperation. And indeed, when I looked closer and also read up in previous history books from the 19th century, there were several notions of an allied council, an allied conference, conférence des ministres alliés, the conférence à Paris. So I looked it up through various archives in Europe, and indeed I found the minutes of the Allied Councils starting in July, 12th July 1815, running up till late 1818, and there was a kind of a follow-up, we'll speak about that later, even up to 1822-23. And if you look with me, you see the people present here. It's the high and mighty of Europe. It's Metternich, it's the Duc de Richelieu. He was not a member of the council because he was the conquered one, but he was invited to sit in. How strange and important is that? Des Castlereagh, the Duke of Wellington, Hardenberg, the Chancellor, Humboldt, the diplomatic brother of the scientist Humboldt, Razumazovsky, on behalf of Tsar Alexander. Sometimes Tsar Alexander sat in there as well, and Capodistrias, also foreign minister of Alexander of the Russians. So you can see it's the four allied powers, the main allied powers that are here to convene on the plan of security for Europe. And just to give you an indication of what kind of archives are in there, that is what I found in the Prussian archives. So there were the minutes, and they're mostly written in a neat French legible handwriting, but then there's oftentimes also many administrative notes written by the Prussians, who were the most diligent in writing notes and nota and memoranda. And this is the handwriting of Blücher himself. And he was notorious because it said that he couldn't write and spell correctly. I hope that my Twitter friend Pertinax is not listening in now, because I know he's a complete admirer of Blücher. To some extent, I'm too, but one thing is for sure, Blücher could fight, but he could not write. And you can see to the right here how Blücher's illegible handwriting was written down. And this is a little note where Blücher threatens to blow up the Pont de Jena, and that no one can stop him, not even Wellington. Well, in the end, all the allies went in together. Tsar Alexander, Wellington, Talleyrand, everyone was there. And in the end, well, Blücher tried, he failed for the first time. So he tried to put in some gunpowder in the pillars of the bridge, but that they weren't able to make the bridge explode. And at the second attempt, he was stopped by the other allied commanders. But it's a great anecdote, and I had great fun writing it down in my book. So the allied powers in Paris, they were there after 1815. And what did they do? Well, they continued what they had been doing on the battlefield to convene about the course of action. There was a lot to be done. And the body that dealt with their communication, logistics, and the government, of course, of the conquered German and the French lands, and running the occupation as such, was called the Allied Council. And well, this first occupation of France, which had been there in 1813, was very short-lived. There was no Allied Council back then. Also because the idea was we're going home quickly and France will not be occupied. It was a quite lenient, a moderate peace. So this is one of those contingencies of history. I know that very many people have wondered what would have happened had Napoleon not returned for the second time, but he did. And this return, the second time, meant that the Treaty of Vienna did not remain a dead letter. So my opinion is that the Treaty of Vienna the Congress of Vienna would not have had that enormous impact that it has had after that had Napoleon not returned. But with the fact that he returned, the Allies knew that they now really had to take their cooperation seriously, that they really had to take the conquest of France, not as a conquest, but as a transformation towards a stable, secure system, more seriously than before. And they put their money where their mouth was, and they went in. And this was something that they didn't do for a long time in 1814. They went home pretty quickly afterwards. There was only a military occupation during the time that the military treaty of the armistice was concluded, 30th of May, 1814. But this time, after Waterloo, they decided not to go home, but do something differently. The aim was to bring back the people of France, in the words of Castlereagh, to moral and peaceful habits. So not just a military principle, to moral and peaceful habits. And this time they needed to stay on and manage the peace together with an Allied Council, but also with a military commission that was suspended below the Allied Council. There was a financial commission, there was a commission for return of looted artwork, there was a commission for the reparations. So it was a whole administrative system that was assembled together, convening from the 12th July onwards to run the occupation of France. And it was consisted of the main players. Just to sum them up: Metternich for Austria, Robert Stewart, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Viscount Castlereagh for Britain, Ambassador Friedrich Wilhelm von Humboldt, Chancellor Prince Karl August von Hardenberg, General Neidhart von Gneisenau for Prussia, Count Carlo Andrea Pozzo di Borgo, Karl von Nesselrode for Russia, and Prince Charles-Maurice de Talleyrand, and later on his successor on 20th September 1815, Armand-Emmanuel Duplessis, the Duke of Richelieu. They were invited only to receive the orders or receive the advices that the Allied Council would give them. And as Castlereagh put it, it's the words of Castlereagh, the Allied machine was thus put in motion. Here are the main players. And it was based on a treaty system. As I said before, most of you will know the Congress of Vienna, the final Treaty of Vienna, dividing the continent, redrawing the borders, saying something about the fate of the Jews as a minority, about constitutions. But my take and my hypothesis for today is that these two treaties that were concluded on the 20th November of 1815, they're perhaps far more important because they gave the Treaty of Vienna teeth and claws. And the treaties are, to the left, the Quadruple Alliance Treaty. It's a military treaty for peacetime, and it installed the Allied Council as a military force for assistance and help in times of assaults. It was not a NATO Article 5 clause, but it came close. And the treaty to the right, that's also the treaty between the four main powers, and it's a treaty on how Paris should pay off its debts and how the occupation of France should be organized. It was quite an extensive treaty. And it also put in charge of most of the commissions and the committees in the council the Duke of Wellington himself. It was on the suggestion of Tsar Alexander that the Duke of Wellington would do it, because he combined this unique talent of both being well, the Prince of Waterloo, as he was called in the Netherlands, the commander of most of the victorious battles, but he was also a great diplomat and, very important, the returned king of France, the Bourbon king, only would work with Wellington. He had his ear, and it was very important. Also interesting to know is that this council didn't sit back idle. It was no Vienna. There were no balls and dancing. Well, there were, but not that often. They met initially almost every day. In the first half year, they almost met every day. And then later on, they met twice or 3 times a week in the morning at 11 o'clock. And they convened at the British Embassy. All the countries kept their notes and their files. I retrieved some of them in Berlin, some of them in London, others in the Netherlands, because they were also involved at some extent. But it was clear from the numbering that it was the main protocols of the Allied Council that were made and protocolized by British secretaries and kept here at the British Embassy, the Rue de Faubourg. Tsar Alexander had his lodgings right next to it. And now to the important part, and this is what I will do in the remainder of my talk. I will briefly talk you through these main strategic and imperial imperatives that the council had. And it had to do with the military, it had to do with politics, it had to do even with art. It was amazing how extensive its scope was. And we can talk in the conclusion why so much of this is lost in public memory. But it was there in 1815, and it had also great impact. So first of all, what the Allied Council needed to do was to stabilize the country, not make France rise up again, not make and make sure that Napoleon was in exile, but also that his cronies, the Napoleonites, the Bonapartists, that they weren't rise up on his behalf either. The Grande Armée had to be demilitarized. Also very interesting, the country had to be de-Bonapartized, meaning that the revolutionary habits should be transformed in what Castlereagh called the moral and the peaceful habits. Payments should be made, dédommagement. And the last principle was that they wanted to also implement, well, not the council forever, because that was not something that the British wanted. They didn't want to have such a long lingering presence on the continent, but there should be a kind of a sustainable element. Strategy should be consolidated and the scope of the council should be expanded. So first of all, the stabilization. Interestingly enough, this council, and I already made this comment, was not consisting of the 8 or even more powers that all furnished troops and soldiers in the last battles of the Napoleonic Wars. And you may remember that Baden-Württemberg was there, that Piedmont was there, Spain and Portugal. So where were they? Had they fallen out of grace or so? No, they hadn't. But interestingly enough, the 4 main powers, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Britain, they considered themselves the first-rank powers of Europe. They had signed the final act of Vienna. Britain also brought in that it was very important that the people on the Allied Council, and that would also profit from the Allied Council's work in returning artwork, handing out reparation monies, that these could only be countries that had signed up to the final act of Vienna, also promising to abolishing slavery, for example. And this is one of the reasons that Spain and Portugal were not allowed to sit in and to join the Allied occupation of France, because it was considered a kind of a party going in France, sitting there, eating from the land, taking from the French what you like. At least that was initially the thought, and that's what the Prussians did in the beginning. Lucia was very vengeful. No, the Spanish and the Portuguese troops that were already coming over the mountains, they were stopped and they were ordered to return because they had not signed this final act of Vienna. They were not allowed to take part in the occupation of France. They belong to the second-rank powers, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, some German states, Piedmont, so the substantial second-rank powers, and then the third-rank powers were the very smaller ones, the lands in Italy, the Polish lands, Hessen-Kassel, countries as Denmark. They were not considered fit enough to sit in and send representatives to the council. Spain and Portugal were, once they signed the treaty, not on the first-rank level on a par with the others, but they could send off representatives to the lower commissions. So it's important to note that the stability of France was considered also the stability of Europe. So vice versa, stabilizing France was a European endeavor. It was a European project. It was not just Britain. And this also explains why so many of this has been lost in memory, because in the early 19th century, there were no professional historians yet, no academic historians. It only came into being. And it came into being as part of the nationalist search. So many of the historians of that period that wrote about this in the 1820s, 30s, 60s, 70s, they only wrote about this period from a highly nationalist point of view. So if you read the Waterloo reports written in Britain, or the Belle Alliance reports written in Prussia, they are very narrowly focused on the war efforts of their own country. So it's very nationalist history writing. Also very funny or interestingly, the French history accounts don't tell you almost nothing about this period, because it's an embarrassment, of course, having the Allied powers sitting in France, running the show there. So there's not much on this in the French textbooks. It's now gradually appearing again, obviously, but it wasn't in the 19th century. So much of this European experiment has been lost to oblivion because of the fact there was no history of writing. That's why we are now trying to assemble it back again. So the stabilizing France, what did it mean? Well, first of all, stabilizing France meant that the Bourbon dynasty should be restored. And that had not been an official war aim. So it was quite, let me bring this up. It was quite a discussion because it had not been promised in the treaties, and the Allied Council had to find a unified solution. And on the 24th of June, after Waterloo, the government led by active Prime Minister Fouché on behalf of Napoleon II offered Wellington and Blücher a truce, but that proposal was rejected since Wellington said, it is not the description of security which the Allied had in view. So they had to discuss other possibilities, for example, a regency headed by Napoleon's wife, the Emperor of Austria's daughter, a regime under Louis Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. There was even some suggestion of elevating Marshal Bernadotte to the throne, but that was already sort of off the table. But the British and the Austrians, they preferred to give the Bourbon King Louis XVIII the benefit of the doubt. As Wellington explained to Bathurst, let me see where he is. Yes, here. I conceive the best security for Europe is the restoration of the king, because any other government will lead to new and endless wars. Bonaparte's army having overturned the king's government, natural simple measure after Bonaparte was prisoner out of the way and the army defeated was to recall the king to authority. But as a condition for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, Wellington demanded that Louis XVIII would embrace reforms and sign a constitution to respect the changes that happened since the fall of the ancient regime. So from the minutes of the Allied Council, you can see that there was put some very heavy pressure on the French to accept the charte, the new French constitution. And I know that in French history textbooks, the charte is presented as a new lease on life after the Napoleonic Wars made by the Bourbons itself, a kind of a gesture by the king. But we know now that it was also the Allies whispering behind the throne, as Wellington had done with so many Indian princes in India in the colonies. You have to bear in mind that many of the people that were active in the Allied Council, Wellington himself, but also Richelieu in Odessa, they had made experiences in the colonies, so they knew how to work with occupied countries, working with other princes, foreign noblemen, and exerting diplomatic pressure in that way as well. Well, the question was, of course, still whether the Bourbon regime was indeed in a position to guarantee stability. And the first sessions of the Allied Council, they were devoted to the question of pairing Bourbon rule with domestic stability. Now, Russians were doubtful, Prussians vengeful, and domestic security meant that Louis XVIII should steer a middle course through the scala of revolution on the one hand and the characters of ultra-royalism. And since the second restoration, all kinds of disturbances had broken out in the south, but the Allies had no occupation forces. Remember the map of the occupation of France, they were not present in the south because that part of the country had liberated itself, or by means of Louis's vindictive brother, Charles-Philippe, Count of Artois, the later King Charles X. And they had managed to position governors there who supported the ultra-royalist cause. And in Paris, the king ignored what was going on in the south. And neither Wellington, Castries, or the other Allied ministers paid much heed to rumors and reports. And only after French and German and British Protestants alerted the council, they knew that there were persecutions going on in the south against the Bonapartists, who were mainly also Protestants. It's the White Terror, which you most certainly have known about. And the council, acting upon the British and Prussian engagement, now sent diplomatic notes. They couldn't send their troops, they threatened to, but they couldn't send their troops because they didn't have the occupation of power there. Very interesting. But they urged Louis to move against the ultras. The terror nonetheless raged on, and then in the end, the Allied Council in the end did dispatch Austrian troops to pacify the unoccupied departments of the Guard in southern France, because there was even a rumor that there was a Second Barthélemy going on. So as you can see, the Allied Council did have clout, did have a lot to do, and the stabilization was not a done deal. This is the Prime Minister of France, Duc de Richelieu, who worked together with Wellington on a very good footing, was very sound and reasonable character, and he tried to run with the Allied Council as good as he could. This is the second principle that the Allied Council had tasked itself to carry out, the demilitarization. And this was also quite an important point to do, because how to demilitarize a country if there is still an army going on. And the Allies reduced their own force in the coming year and down to 150,000, consisting of 5 cohorts, 4 for the main Allied powers, 1 for the smaller German states. This force would remain in place at the occupational territories and run the territory until, and this is the connection that was made between the principle of demilitarization, occupation, and reparation, the Allied forces would remain in France, in place, until France had paid the yet to be determined reparations and standing arrears, including the cost of maintaining the troops. So France had to pay for its own occupation. And the remainders of the Grande Armée, they had to be pushed south. They had to march south across the Loire, and there they had to remain put in place until they were transformed and reorganized by the French themselves. But they were not allowed to pass across the Loire and come into the Allied occupied territories, because that would, of course, inevitably lead to enormous clashes. So you could say that the occupation and the demobilization of the French army required quite some imperial military management, and it transformed northern and eastern France into an alien country where French residents were subject to foreign troops. And Prussian forces had quite a bad reputation in the beginning, but the Russian forces, they were quite loved, at least in the earlier stages. And as I said, Christine Haynes has described how the occupiers and indigenous people tried to understand each other, how even vocabularies were changed amongst them to speak with each other, and that sometimes even a sense of fraternity and mutual respect took place, also because the demilitarization and the occupation were carried out on a central level. So the troops were not allowed, and they would be punished, sent home without honors by Wellington himself, if they would engage in looting and plundering. And of course, there were many, manifold reports of exactly that, looting and plundering and shooting and even rape, but it was prohibited. And Wellington, well, he couldn't be everywhere, of course, but he sent out commands and orders that the commissioners of the Allied provinces, that they should take heed, that their soldiers paid attention to it. And Blücher was prohibited from taking cash money out of the municipal treasures and municipal coffers, because all the monies and all the incomes that the French had to pay had to be distributed and disseminated centrally, so that not one country, not one Allied power could profit more to its own advantage in comparison with the others. So it was an even distributed system of occupation, system of plunder, the French said, of course, and Talleyrand later on in Richelieu, they made quite some protest, but at least there was no brute force, there was not taking away of cash or livestock. It had to be organized on a central administrative level. You can imagine how much work that was and how many committees and commissions were tasked to do so. In the meantime, Louis XVIII could build his new army. A third principle that the council also had to work with, also because the Bonapartist unrest, revolutionary attacks, brigandry, even you could say improvised attacks from the woodlands and the forest sites to the Allied troops as they passed by, were quite a hinder, were quite a nuisance, or even an obstacle to running a smooth system of occupation. But also with a mind on a more strategic future, the future of stability, preventing forever a return of Napoleon or his siblings, could only be ensured if the country was really de-Bonapartized, de-revolutionized, if the hearts and minds were colonized to that matter, and the terror was fought off. So this transformation towards peaceful, orderly, and stable nation, how did they do that? Unrest was there all along. It didn't flare up later. It was there from the earliest beginning. And the activities of the Allied Council were indeed heavily devoted to taking steps to unnerve resurfacing sympathies for Napoleon and his relatives. And this was called the third principle of salutary precaution. And in order to do this, and it was one of my main interesting findings, I thought, is the fact that they appointed Justus von Groner, a Prussian bureaucrat, who had earned his honors in Berlin as a director for the police, but who was also in charge of colonizing the Eastern Prussian territory. So he had been out there colonizing hearts and minds of Polish East Prussian peoples before that. So now he was hauled back. He was also employed by Tsar Alexander at some point to run a spy system. So it was a man who was very well honed in skills of intelligence, police skills, administrative skills. And Justus von Groner was appointed by Wellington and Hardenberg to run the first European intelligence service. It was an inter-allied intelligence service intended to protect the military security of the allied forces, as you can imagine, but also to introduce all kinds of security measures in France itself. For example, to introduce an allied passport, to introduce a registration system for returning and demobilizing French soldiers. They all had to be written and registered to know their names in order that they wouldn't go back home in the northern and the eastern part. So those demobilized soldiers, they could not return. And very interestingly, Groner was assisted and inspired by Joseph Fouché, who had run the Napoleonic intelligence services. And very interesting, one of the first things that Groner set up was a network of spies that had to collect in the French cafes and on the streets de fausses nouvelles, the geruchten, the falsche geruchten, the fake news on what was going on in France. So at some point there were fausse nouvelles, fake news, that Napoleon was indeed hiring an army again, that he was back for a third time, or that his brother, or that others, or even the Turks were in Berlin and that they were coming over. So all kinds of quite some apocalyptic notions in 1815, 1816, and then again in 1817. And Groner made note of them on a daily basis, and he sent his intelligence briefs to the Allied Council. You can see that here to the left, the geruchten, the fake news report from Groner. This is a political caricature depicting the British in the French cafes, but this is also where the spies sit. You can imagine the gentleman there with the top hat being a spy and collecting rumors and writing them down for Groner himself. But there was more than just reporting on unrest and rebellion. There was also real unrest and rebellion. You all know about the book Phantom Terror. Now I forgot the name. Sorry, got to write it down. I remember in a minute. Phantom Terror book, Zamoyski, Adam Zamoyski, of course. A famous book, it's a brilliant book and it's a great read. But according to Zamoyski, it was mostly a phantom, but it was not completely true. There were indeed Bonapartists, terrorists even. A terrorist was someone formerly who voted for the execution of Louis XVI. But after 1815, people that supported the terrorists were also considered Bonapartists or revolutionaries, were sometimes also described as terrorists. And Richelieu was ordered to write down a list of suspected terrorists and radicals that should be put in exile. So a kind of blacklist, if you like. And there were also terrorist attacks, or at least attempts of terrorist attacks. And Groner had to prevent those attacks, or at least sort them out and prosecute the people that were behind them. And the Allies and Groner indeed increasingly grew wary of rumors that an attack on Friedrich Wilhelm III, IV, or Louis XVIII were imminent. And news about the massacres in the French South, the White Terror, was there as well. And then in in early 1816, when the list of terrorists dangereux was grown so long that the council disseminated the lists to other courts of Europe, demanding that they identify the French fugitives and put them under surveillance. And these blacklisted individuals, they were prohibited to settle anywhere near the border of France, were only granted passport for one of the countries represented in the Allied Council. And one of the persons that became a victim of this blacklisting was Hortense de Beauharnais herself. So she was not allowed anymore to remain in France, neither were the other members and relatives of the Bonapartist family, and they were ordered to go to Austria because, as Metternich put it in the Allied Council, there a solid system of surveillance could be put in place, and indeed it was. In June 1816, Wellington's house, he was the commander of the Allied forces and the chairman of the Allied Council, was set on fire on the night of the 10th, 11th February 1818. An aggrieved Jacobin from Brussels named Cantillon attempted to assassinate the Duke. The perpetrators were found. For the Allied Council, especially for Prussia, Russia, and Austria, these attacks were linked to émigré Bonapartists from Brussels and Krakow, from revolutionaries everywhere in Europe, and they did kind of connect the dots and put up the specter of a phantom terror. But as my point was before, the extent to which they connected dots and made it a gigantic master plan or conspiracy run by exiled Bonapartists was quite exaggerated. But on the ground, there were quite some attacks. For example, this attack. At the time, Groener's secret police was busy terminating those plots, but in 1817, Metternich took over the intelligence and the counter-revolutionary measures. He also set up, with the Karlsbader decrees in the German lands, a central intelligence agency. And when he proposed to the Allied Council to transform Groener's intelligence apparatus in a European police force, a kind of European FBI, the British stalled. And also the Dutch king, William I, also protested. The council was not there to run the businesses of the world. And indeed, the council stopped the intelligence work at the time also because the first steps were taken to dissolve the council and end the occupation. But as you can see, the first beginnings were there. This is a thank you letter on the occasion of a thwarted attack on the British Parliament from the British Regent King of Prince Regent to the King of Prussia. This is my last, not the last one before the last principle. This is also a pivotal part of the council's work, because what I had to do, they had to manage the French payments and the arrangement of financial security. And initially the question was, do the French have to pay, or do they just take their lands? Because land can also count as a payment for sufferings. And the Prussians already in 1814, they demanded a redress. Prussia did, certainly. And reparations were not enough, the Germans found. And they also would need some French territory to ensure a better protection at their western borders. And they had to play, of course, to the public opinion at home, the Rijnbund, for example. And that's why the Prussian commander of Paris, Muffling, and then later on the Prussians, they pushed for higher reparations. And the Dutch and the Prussians together, they were also the ones who demanded their looted artworks back. The Louvre was full with masterpieces from Groner, from Rubens, and the Dutch and the Prussians wanted them back. But the financial commissions, they were quite difficult to estimate because how much had France had to pay? Well, initially the first step was that Wellington and the Russians told the Prussians off and said, we're not going to strip off more land from France. This was a suggestion made by the Prussians, as you can see. So the red line is the border of 1790, but the blue border is the border that the Prussians suggested to strip off parts of the land to give to the Germans. But as Wellington rightly said, this would only foster new resentments and bring out new wars. So we're not going to do that. We're going to set the bar high, and we're going to measure the indemnifications, and not just indemnifications and reparations for the past 100 days war, but also the French now really have to pay their arrear debts, the liquidation of private claims and standing debts that were made in the previous years by the French occupiers. And Prime Minister Richelieu and the Control General of Finance, Baron Louis, they had to negotiate with the European counterparts to the burden of payments. And it was quite a record that the Allied came up. You can see here that the French had to make 700 million of payments for the 100 jours period. They had to come up with the liquidation of the individual debts for the occupation costs for the first year, and then also for the later year, the interest penalties and arrears, additional occupation costs. So in total, 1,650, approximately, perhaps even 1,950 millions, so 2 billion French francs. And as you can see from the right, what I calculated was that they also, indeed, astonishingly so, they managed to pay it off. This is really amazing, because the Germans made such a fuss after the First World War, and the French, they just paid their monies back. And this is how it was done. It was calculated on a very rigid and a very transparent manner, and it was all approved by the Allied Council and the sub-financial committees. These are lists taken from a Belgian city of Oudenaarde, and citizens and cities alike, they could submit their records, their receipts, their calculations, and they would be assessed by the Allied Council and tested whether they were correct, and if so, they were granted. How did the French do that? As I said, again, it was Wellington who made this happen. Well, the main drive for the French was to get the Allies out of their country, bring them bloody back home. So they had to pay. They knew that. There was no way around it. So the Allied army was there to enforce the payments. But as the French king said, my coffers are empty. There's nothing in it anymore. So it was Wellington again. He had reined in a Prussian drive for revenge, but now he had to come up with an arrangement for the payments, and also helped by Tsar Alexander. And how did they do it? They developed, Wellington mostly, but also with the help of Richelieu, a plan to enlist international financial assistance. Via Dutch contacts, the Baring houses, the private banking house of Hope and Baring, it's now E&J, in London and Amsterdam, they were contacted, and a large loan was secured in 1817, with the second following in 1818. A public response to the loans, and these loans, so they were acquired by the Baring House, who ran a great risk in doing so. But Baring did it because he knew that Wellington, the Allied army, were kind of his guarantee, so the money would be paid back. But how was the money raised then? By selling out European obligations. So fascinatingly enough, 12 times as many subscriptions from the whole of Europe came in to buy these financial security. It was bankers that bought them in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France as well, and in England, but also private investors. So surprisingly enough, the burden of debt that rested on France was paid off by European investors, and made possible by the loans that Baring gave them. And France could, within 3 years, now fulfill all its outstanding financial loans. And these are all the bankers that work together. You can see a whole network of European cost, if you like, of European financial hothouses, going to the Ouvraars in Paris, the Raids and Irvings, the Rothschilds that were left out in the beginning, but 1818 they were invited as well. The Dutch, the Silham House, Lafitte, of course, the Bank of Scotland, but most prominent were still the Barings at this point. This brings me to the last principle, expanding the scope. So there was this kind of the discussion. What should the Allied Council do? Well, it should stabilize, de-Bonapartize, secure Europe by securing France. But when was the job done? Well, it was done once France had paid off its debts. It was done once the Allied army of occupation was not longer sustainable, because there were so many protests and revolts in the French society against the presence of the Allied soldiers, and they were eating away through the French reserves, of course, as you can imagine. So the treaty work was there. The conference system was there. Interestingly enough, and again, Wellington, as always, came up with the suggestion, we can bring the boys back home, but we should erect another, a more sustainable security system in the form of fortresses, stone and masonry. We should also fight the revolutionary spirit with a kind of an allied intelligence security service, but that's not something the British would want to be part of it, so that they sort of delegated to Metternich, with the Central Intelligence Agency. So you could say the first thing succeeded, second as well. The third, expanding the code, bringing sustainable security, did not succeed, fight the revolutionary spirit at an allied council. Reparations were completed. That should have been green, I think, sorry, not a cross. And then they had the idea to expand the Allied Council to the Americas and to North Africa. And in North Africa, they did so. They run counter-piracy operations together. And they also went to Americas. I walk you briefly through it, based all on Article 6 of the Quadruple Treaty that I put up before, to facilitate, secure the execution of the present treaty. Very interestingly enough, to renew meetings at fixed periods under the immediate auspices of the sovereigns themselves or by the ministers. You could say that at this moment, conference diplomacy was really invented, because up until 1815, there was a handful of big international meetings. After 1815, almost every 4 or 5 years, there was a ministerial conference, a conference on the London Conference, on slavery, but also on the Netherlands later on. There was a conference on the Papal States, there was a conference on the Sanitary Conventions, there was the conference of Rome, the conference on the Rhine, on the Danube, all kinds of conferences to indeed sustain the Allied cooperation, perhaps not on the level of the princes, but on the level of the ministers. What they also did, they did indeed, Allied Council used the monies that the French paid them back, they used it to create a ring of fortresses, a bulwark of Europe, a boulevard de l'Europe, starting at Newport, Ostende, Oudenaarde, via the Dutch-French border, which was including with Belgium then, via the German Confederation, down through Italy to the Mediterranean. So the Wellington Barrier, as it was called, was indeed completed. This is a proud picture of King William I, who oversaw the construction of the fortresses himself. He's even pointing to a map. Here you see a map of the fortress, and still there's not that many remaining fortresses left, because most of the fortresses were demolished in the First World War or in the Second World War. You can see this is the age of fortresses being built with very nice, intricate brick patterns. So it was not beton yet, concrete materials yet, it was brick. The looted artworks were restored. This is the Rubens paint. You can see them hold through the gates of, where is it? It's Antwerp, where they were restored to the Dutch countries. Fighting piracy was a done deal. They also tried to discuss it to fighting pirates and rebels in South America. At least that's what the Spanish and the Portuguese tried to implore on the Allied Council. And there was even a discussion of a médiation européen, a responsibility to defend monarchies there. So the Paris Conference continued to discuss this until the 1822s, but North America, United States, and also Britain did not feel up to it, and they tried to mediate the conflict between the Portuguese and the Spanish in the Americas, but the Nouveau Monde, the Second Hemisphere, they were left to their own devices. So the Allied Council did not expand its scope there. I'm going to wrap up. What remained of the Allied Council? So nothing and a lot, you could argue. Nothing in the sense that the fortresses are almost not visible anymore. No one remembers the Allied Council. You could say it's kind of proto-NATO, but no one makes that claim. So it's sort of lost in public memory. On the other hand, there are these obelisks where Spain and Portugal, the Netherlands, Republic and Tyranny, India protected, sort of points to this common European project. There's another memorial, Asia and Europe saved by thee. So it's there. But most importantly, there is a legacy of the Allied Council, and that's the conference diplomacy, to create sustainable security systems in peacetime. And that was new and novel. This is the Conference de Londres, for example, and there were more conferences, the 17, 27, 30, 49, so far more than there were before that. And this brings me to the end of my talk. So the Allied Council fought terror and took their anti-revolutionary responsibility. You could say it was a birthplace for Europe's mission civilisatrice. It was the birthplace of the four powers that put themselves up as imperial powers. The heydays of high imperialism started, high expansionist imperialism started. So also to make the claim that it was not just a benevolent or a moral high standard that was followed. It was also the beginning of imperial cooperation. So not just competition, but also cooperation. The world created on the base tables in Paris was inherently hierarchic. It was imperial. It was driven by security logics, preventative security logic, revolutionaries, freedom fighters, activists. They should be banned. They should be brought under control. And in this sense, the Allied Council brought peace, brought kind of sustainable security, but it was a highly imperial one. So thank you for listening to my account of the transformation that came after 1815. Over to you, Tom.
Actually, I'm going to let Chris field the questions, and then I'm going to put a link to your book in the chat and the comments. So thanks, Beatrice.
So thank you so much. I will just remind all our audience just quickly that there is a bit of a delay between what the conversation we're having and what's appearing on YouTube. So sometimes I miss questions because sort of we wrap up and then they're posted afterwards. So I apologize if that happens, but we will do our best to get to as many of the questions as we can. I would like to start with one that I hope is a quick, easy one. David Hollins is asking, where are the spy records of Groner?
Yes, that's a very good question. The spy records of Groner are where I found them at the Prussian Archives in Berlin. So that's where I found them. I didn't find them anywhere else. I found them here at the Geheime Staatsarchiv Preußische Kulturbesitz in Berlin. That was an easy one.
So a little bit more complicated then. Perhaps I'm sorry, I lost the name in the chat, but somebody was asking about the role that class played in sort of the restoration decisions. So were the concerns of common people ever sort of considered? Were they did they reach out to try to a more common audience? Because we really have this feeling that it was the princes and the upper echelons of sort of European society that are dictating almost these terms. But were the common people ever considered?
That's an excellent question, and it's so difficult to answer because we don't have opinion polls. We don't have so many records of ordinary people because their records have been lost in history. So formally, they were not taken into account. Even democracies in the Netherlands and in Britain, they were no liberal, modern democracies yet. The Netherlands was a constitutional monarchy, not a democracy. That only came in 1848. So no, in that sense, it was a highly classified, stratified society, and that also was, how do you say, transferred into the Allied Council, where all the members were, of course, noblemen, nobility. But things were starting to change. If you notice the bankers that I brought in the last slide on the Financial Commission, a lot of bourgeois people from the banking houses, but also private investors, they were also invited to take part. And very interestingly, with the financial reparations and the private indemnities, citizens and city councils alike were invited to hand in their claims. So there was a kind of a participation in the war indemnities. The monies did not go back to the coffers of the kings and the monarchs. It went into the fortresses and it came back to the cities and the cities themselves. So that was kind of a democratified financial a reparation that was made. And I think that was quite novel, that they really did it centrally, administratively, and also evenly. And there's another way where the ordinary common man was being heard, again, via the intelligence reports. So voices on the streets, the worries, the concerns of ordinary people, they were transported to the Allied Council. And for example, coming from the south, what I said, where the White Terror was waging and hurting so many Protestant allegiate followers of Napoleon, protest petitions were filed from people from the south of France. They were initially not being heard, and then French Protestants, churches, German Protestant, Dutch, they also filed petitions and complaints to the Allied Council by letters. You can find them in the various archives. And then the Allied Council also listened, and they tried to listen to these voices and try to bring order back. Far too late, far too little, but it was there. So you can see that on specific topical themes on the agenda, the Allied Council listened to what was going on the ground. Also because they knew that people were traumatized. It was in their own interest that no revolt, no new war broke out. So they had, from an information base, they had to know what the common people, the great unwashed, as they were called, what they thought. And Metternich was also very wary, always very wary of the great revolutionary masses. They had risen once in 1789, 90, they could do it again. So they were trying to listen to these voices, but they made the decisions.
Fascinating. And sort of a follow-up on that question. Of course, you mentioned that Wellington eventually really pushed for the Bourbon restoration, and of course that's what ended up happening. But you also mentioned sort of several other considerations, sort of what they thought, other options that they considered after Napoleon. Were there any considerations that didn't involve a new monarch, or
No.
was that just sort of assumed?
No, that's a very good question as well. In fact, it's all often presumed that bringing back the monarchs is the main argument for claiming that there was a restoration. But the restoration only really took place in France with King Louis XVIII, but in other countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, Italy, new kings were put in place in places where there hadn't been a king before. And also in Vienna, part of the German and Italian lands, they were forged together, they were fused together to make them bigger. And Castlereagh once formulated in a letter to Dutch King William I, he said, you need to come back as a king. So it was not King William I who made the Dutch Orange House. You could also say he was the last stadtholder William VI. He didn't make the claim that he wanted to come back as a king, but Castlereagh told him to. The system of Europe needs to be plus monarchique, more monarchical. Why was that? Because only monarchies were considered central, forceful, viable, administrative, solid systems that could fend off another invasion, and that also could join forces with the other crowned heads of Europe. So the system to bring in new monarchs, old monarchs, in a new fashion. So the monarch Louis XVIII, he was brought back, but he was forced by the Allies to accept a constitution, which was a novel system. His brother Charles X, of course, upended that, but that led to the Revolution of 1830. So you could say that the restoration was in part true. It was the feudal system of monarchs, but these monarchs, they were tied to constitutions far more than just to divine will or their own will than they were before. So it's a hybrid form, transforming to a modernized, stronger centralized, administratively stronger centralized nation states.
So they really saw it as the best of both worlds. We're modernizing, but we're keeping that stability.
Right.
Yes. So So on that note, again, sort of leaping off of that, um, how effective do you think this security was? Now, we often hear people say, the peace after 1815 and was incredibly effective because we didn't have another European war for 100 years. But I think that's simplistic, right? There were certainly upheaval in Europe, and there was certainly conflict in Europe throughout the 19th century. So overall, do you think this system was really effective for the security of Europe, or was that overstating it to say that it was peace for 100 years?
Yeah. Well, again, the question is, how do you measure the impact or effectiveness of a system? If you measure the system of the Allied Council, its security system, on the basis of its own principles for salutary precaution, as they called it, they managed to tick off some of those salutary precautions. They ticked off the bulwark of fortresses. They ticked off the demobilizing, the demilitarizing of France. They ticked off compelling and forcing France to pay back the monies. I think that's one of the most amazing and impressive achievements and effects that this Allied system conceived. And you have to imagine, it was part and parcel to the security system, because the French knew if we start another war, we end up with even more billion high claims made by the Allied forces. So, and also the fact with the Quadruple Alliance that there was now a system in Europe that brought the Allied powers together on a sustainable and a lasting base, because that was exactly what brought the insecurity of the 18th century and of the Napoleonic Wars, that the Allies couldn't find their way on a similar footing all along. I mean, even in 1812, 1813, 1814, Metternich was negotiating with Napoleon secretly. There was talk of divided systems of peace and security. So the fact that the Allied powers got their act together was quite an effect and achievement. And this is also, I think, something that contributed to the fact that there was no major war between the five Allied powers, with four Allied powers plus France, because France was invited as a member to the Quadruple Alliance, to Article 6, not to the whole Quadruple Alliance, but only to Article 6 in 1818. So you could say it was now a pentarchy that ran Europe. And that pretty much stayed in place until the Crimean War. And even then, the wars remained confined to the region of that part of the world and did not spill out to the rest of the world. On the other hand, you could also say the system of mutual security that the Allied Council put into place effectively was such an imperial system of security that it, from the onset onward, from 1815-16 onwards, started to bring devastation and insecurity to all the peoples that fell outside the scope of the Allied Council. Remember that I brought up this ranking of powers, the first, the second, the third rank. All the other powers outside of Europe, they were not considered part of the concept of Europe. The Ottoman Empire was not considered part of the circle of European powers. Even John Quincy Adams tried to wriggle himself into the concept of Europe in 1818, and he was pushed outside. He was considered too little. It's in his own words, in his own memoirs, he describes that he had this conversation with Castro. So you could say the effectiveness of this Allied Council, this concept of security, was that it also unleashed European high imperialism and unleashed a situation of insecurity for the people in Singapore, in the Indies, in India, in the Crimea, in the Americas. So it set off new imperial conflicts and wars. So how secure is that? So it depends very much. The security question depends very much on your perspective. Whose security? For whom was it secure?
Fascinating. Thank you. And I know that you said you've got kids, so I hope I'll do one more, but it's a massive question, so I don't expect you to answer it here. But I wonder if you've ever, in your research, I found, especially at the very beginning when you were talking about sort of the global upheaval and then the expectations coming out of, so 1815 we want to we want a stability, we want a peace, we want a security. I found myself very much comparing that to 1918 and 1919. And I wonder if in your work, if you've ever compared and contrasted those two, post-conflict pieces and how well they worked, but also the expectations. And as I say, I don't expect you to answer that massive question now, but I wonder if you've considered it in your work or if you have articles or books or that sort of thing on it.
No, I did. I love that question. I did a talk once where I discussed the way the peacemakers of 1918, 1919 draw upon the lessons of 1815. And interestingly enough, in 1918, 1919, people said we're not going to do it like 1815, mostly because President Wilson thought it was too imperial, it was too aggressive, too much balance of power, also too much based on the class system, on the elites. It's not how we're going to make the peace. Now we're going to build the peace on the principles of security that were en vogue in 1918-19. And Wilson let himself be guided by the principle of self-determination. So the countries and the nations of Europe can determine for themselves. That we know where that led to. And the French and the Germans also, the French and the British also did not want to invite the Germans to the negotiation table in discussing the reparations that they had to pay. And as I discussed before, Richelieu, Talleyrand, Louis XVIII, they were considered speaking partners. Well, they had to receive the orders, yes, but on the other hand, they were treated with respect, and they were also helped in getting the funding, getting the money via these bankers. So there was, of course, this asymmetry of power between the Allied forces and France, but France was treated with respect, was invited back on the table right away, and even invited to the treaty in 1818. So I think the way the peace of 1850 was discarded as an elitist, conservative peace in 1918 is not right, because what Wilson did in 1918, what the French and the British did in 1918, was sowing the seed of resentment and creating and widening the rifts, polarizations in society. They did not try to stabilize and de-revolutionize Germany. They even sort of heightened the fire of protest there. So you could discuss this at another talk in length, to the comparison between 1815 and 1819. I think 1815 has gotten too much of short shrift, and we should re-evaluate what really happened in 1815, the conference diplomacy, and the way victors and victorious and conquered people talk together, work together in conference, and the solution was far more future-oriented than the peacemakers of 1918 did. So I think we should re-evaluate at least that part of the peace of 1850. I mean, the imperial part was, of course, also there, and I made that point before. So I'm not going to brandish the peace of 1815 as the most noble peace there was. It wasn't. But some parts of this were quite clever.
Right. That sounds like a fascinating talk. We'll have to talk to Tom and see if we can get you back sometime. But before I turn it back over to Tom, I want to say thank you so much. That was fantastic. I thoroughly enjoyed that afternoon. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And please let me put up the other projects that we run in our project group, where my colleagues, Erik de Lange, Ozan Ozafci, Konstantin Adelianu, also need to have a shout out, because they have also worked on the conference diplomacy that came into existence after 1850. So I didn't do it alone. That's important to underline. So thank you very much for having me here, and enjoy your day.
So I'm going to wrap this up. I don't know, there's much more to say. Outstanding talk. We're getting great feedback in the chat. Beatrice, it was a real pleasure having you here this afternoon and sharing you with our audience. So thanks again. And then we'll explore options for future talks as we build out our 2022 schedule. So, all right, I'm going to stop sharing in a moment here. Everyone have a great afternoon. Thank you for your support.